Okay, so let's begin. Prof, as you asked me to address you, Fawaz, let's begin with you. Is the world more imbalanced because it's still trying to understand how everything fits together post the collapse of the Soviet Union? We're only talking, what, less than 30 years. Is there more imbalance now than there was in that bipolar world we were used to? And don't forget, please, just keep the microphones close to your mouths because everybody needs to hear you. Great. Okay.
I think if we take
We can't hear this. Ah, you have to press a button. You have to press this one. Let's see. Magic. Go.
Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, you have to press that button, and then when you're not speaking, press it again. Thanks for the tip.
I think if we take the big picture look, what we have witnessed in the past 20 years or so is that this is a transitional moment in international politics. It's a transitional moment in international politics because America's hegemonic basically power has relatively declined vis-a-vis other powers. So you have the rise of China, even though the United States continues to be the most powerful nation in the world, it can no longer really dictate world events as it used to be between 1947, the beginning of the Cold War, and up to the American-led invasion and occupation of Iraq. So you have the rise of China, which is a very powerful nation, and another block in the international system, call them whatever you want. The BRIC nations, emerging markets, you're talking about Turkey, you're talking about Brazil, South Africa, Mexico, India, and what have you. I think I would not be exaggerating if I say this is the most dangerous moment in the international system since the end of World War II in 1945. What we are seeing now in the international system is the convergence of economic, social, and military crisis really all over the world. It's what we call an inflection point in world politics. I mean, the minister talked about think about the loose talks about nuclear weapons now. I mean, the Russian leadership has made it very clear. If Russia's national security is threatened, it could think the unthinkable, point one. Think of the emerging fault line between the United States and China. Many American strategists and Chinese strategists are talking about the possibility of military conflict, not just in economic warfare, between China and the United States. Think about the war in the heart of the Middle East, what has been happening in Gaza, the genocide and the war crimes. And we could easily really wake up in the next few weeks and see a greater war between Iran on the one hand and its allies, and a war between the United States and Israel, if basically Benjamin Netanyahu has his day. Think of what's happening in terms of cultural and social dynamics, the rise of far-right movement across the world, or I would say, probably I should be talking about really the new fascist movement in the world. Think about ethnic nationalism, populism. Think about the fragmentation in the international political and economic order in the international system. Think about economic collapse in many countries in the world, including my own native country, Lebanon. So the reality is, I mean, what you have, given this inflection point in the international system, my simple question as a human being, forget about being an academic, where are, the firefighters? Where is the global leadership? Where are basically the wise men and women who basically try to put out the fires? Here you have the most powerful nation in the world, the United States. I'm not exaggerating, we'll come back to it. The United States now is an arsonist, literally an arsonist. It's an arsonist in the Middle East. It's militarizing the international system from the China Sea to Europe to the Middle East itself. And this is why we have really what I call a vacuum of global leadership. And my hope is that the third powers, the third alternative, a coalition, a global coalition of humanity would fill this particular global vacuum in international leadership and prevent the unthinkable happening in the world.
Okay, interesting you mentioned third powers. I think I call them middle powers. Are we talking about that same kind of newish actor who's gaining more influence on the stage? Just yes or no, because we're going to move on. You've introduced so many different items here.
Yeah.
We're talking middle actors are the same as third actors, right?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
You know these middle actors that we talk about. Turkey is a great example. These countries that are gaining influence and are trying to find their way in this new multilateral order. That's what you mean by third
Absolutely.
countries? Okay.
I meant really middle powers.
Yes.
And the middle powers are really a rising bloc in international politics and international economics. They could really become a major bloc, and in playing this kind of balancing act between the United States on the one hand and China.
Great. Okay. Foreign Minister Kar, if we can ask you, because what Professor Georges has just said about this vacuum of leadership, you having been in those rooms where decision makers can actually make a difference to the outside world, how, is depressed the right word? How disappointed are you at the lack of leadership that we're seeing?
I think disappointed would be an understatement.
Yeah.
I think I'm appalled, shocked, and very, very scared about what is happening in the world today. And the reason for that is that, and I tend to agree exactly with most of the things, if not everything that Professor said. And I found it interesting because I'm not a professor, I'm not an academic, I'm a practitioner of foreign policy at best, right? But been there for 15 years, seen how the world changed from right under, in front of us on broad daylight. But really, if you try and put it all down in measurable terms, in something that we can all understand and grasp, the big picture is nobody's fighting for the leadership of the world today. If we were fighting for the leadership of the world, we'd be dealing with issues like climate change, how to control AI, how to regulate AI, how to ensure that nuclear security remains something which is, there. What we're seeing in the world is a fight for hegemonic power, and in some ways, maybe a play out of the Thucydides trap. But more importantly, what is being forgotten is that whereas in the past, since 1945, a lot of people believe there was a lot of peace there all over the world. There was a lot of peace in Europe, perhaps. There was not a lot of peace all over the world. Post 9/11, if you look at the cost of war project of the Brown University, Watson Institute, they tell you that 38 million people have been displaced after post 9/11 wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. So while as there was balance, there was non-chaos or general peace in the heartland, let's not call it heartland, in Europe and most of North America, how those wars played out, which were in the name of human rights, democracy, values, liberal values, etc., how they played out in the world was not according to the values that were espoused within the mainland, so to speak. And now we are watching in broad daylight, live-streamed, a genocide happening, and the people who were supposed to be the preservers of that order and the rules-based system are actually breaking it down, hammering it down themselves, and calling into question every institution that exists, which is supposed to create that order. And I do want to emphasize over here a difference, because you asked an interesting question, and you asked a question to Professor. You didn't ask me such an interesting question, but to Professor you asked a very interesting question. And the question was that are we at a worse moment in some ways than the Cold War? And I would say we absolutely are, because we're all very confused, because during Cold War we knew what we were fighting for. We knew we were fighting for two different ideologies. Right now, I don't think anyone knows what we're fighting for, except exceptionalism. The fight seems to be for exceptionalism. So everybody seems to be saying, let's go with the rules-based order, except for our friends. And you know what that does? That takes away any credibility or predictability from the preservers of the rules-based order. So now let me just give you 2-3 examples which really accentuate what I'm saying. When you have senators from the United States of America saying that they would sanction any country, including France, Germany, and that little Canada, as they call it, if they follow the ICC, do you know what it says to the rest of the world? The strong do what they must, what they will, and the weak shall suffer what they must, right? When you have countries which say that we have a moral responsibility because of our history, a historical responsibility, should that historical responsibility of Germany not to ensure that there is no more genocide, or should it be to ensure that the same people who went through genocide should now be propagated and enabled to do another genocide on another people? So the world is fracturing in front of us, and what we don't see is leadership. And we have all of these claims of everyone trying to fight for leadership, whereas it is clear now that people are only fighting for hegemonic power. And what you call the middle powers, if I may say, If the middle powers, such as, for instance, India, you will not argue is not a middle power. You will absolutely put it in the bracket of a middle power, emerging power, whatever it is. But from my vantage point, where geography has taken me or where I come from, India is currently being enabled to be a rogue state by the very powers which are supposed to be the holders of order. And when Pakistan says, oh, India is doing these all sorts of incidents and killing with impunity and has provided this impunity, nobody listens. But when Canada says that even in our soil and even in the United States, so this is what you're giving to states, even the middle powers, rather than them being encouraged to follow order and rules-based order and law and international law, you're actually encouraging them to be rogue because guess what? We have your back. And if we have the back of anyone, anything is allowed. So this is what is looking like a disorderly, world.
Yep.
Right.
Professor Salami, how much does the credibility of this multilateral world that is developing depend on Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant being arrested if they leave Israel? Well remembered, sir.
That was really bad news for any multilateral sort of supporter of multilateralism. Thank you. I think the international system is now characterized by three big features I keep finding in everyday's news. The first one is the deregulation of force. For a long time, force was regulated. You needed an authorization from the Security Council before attacking. You needed some kind of a legitimate reason to attack somebody else. But like 20 years ago, we started a process of deregulation of force. You use force whenever you want, for whatever reason you think. And it started with the invasion of Iraq in 2003, where the country that has contributed most to the international order in 1945, to the Bretton Woods economic order, to the United Nations formation, was the one violating its own institutions and invading Iraq without a legitimate reason and without authorization of the Security Council, and with the opposition of leading powers in the world, such as Russia, France, Germany, the Pope, and you name it. This deregulation of force was emulated by other powers, since the principal power was using force without authorization. Other powers in the world started doing the same. So you saw Russia invading Georgia, then Russia invading Ukraine the first time in 2014, and again in 2022. And later, other powers started also using force in Africa, in the Middle East, and elsewhere. And with Netanyahu in Gaza, we have reached the sort of maximum of the deregulation of force, both in the legitimacy of the recourse to force and in the way you conduct your war using all violations of international humanitarian law. So the first feature is deregulation of force. The second feature is what I call diplomatic opportunism. Now you can be part of an alliance and part of another alliance. You can join all the international organizations you want. You can basically think that you are not you don't have to stick to any kind of long-term relationship with anybody. So you can have excellent trade relations with one country and horrible geostrategic relations with the same country. To give you just one example, during the Cold War, there was like a trade relation between the Soviet Union and the United States of $1 billion a year. Now you have like a Cold War with China with $1 billion of trade every day.
Yeah.
So we are at the age of opportunism. You can have one part of your relation in good terms and another in horrible terms, and you can join an alliance while looking for another one. You can buy your weapons wherever you want and then use these weapons against whom you want. It's the reign of opportunism rather than principle. And the third feature is the paralysis of international organizations. The security, look, the United States of America has used the veto power to protect Israel 49 times in the Security Council. When one country uses this veto power 49 times to defend an ally, how could the Security Council survive such a massive use of? And it's the same for other countries as well. I mean, the Security Council is a state of paralysis. Look at what happened at the G20 in Brazil last week. They couldn't agree really on how to tackle numerous issues. Look at the threat of protectionism that is central in the election of Donald Trump. Look at what happened in Baku, where they could not find a way of financing climate change prerequisites. So the multilaterals, and look at the WTO. The WTO is dead, my friend. It's entirely dead. Fortunately, there are still a few agencies in the UN system, basically humanitarian agencies such as HCR or the World Food Program, etc., still helping people in state of misery to have a better life. But these exceptions, although I praise them and I respect them, are not enough to allow a multilateral system to be operational. It is in state of paralysis. So if you put together deregulation of force, diplomatic opportunism, and the paralysis of international organizations, you understand where we are today.
Absolutely astonishing. You're completely right. The UN Security Council, as we all know, has been hampered by the presence of those 5 permanent members and their veto powers. At COP29 in Baku, poorer developing countries wanted $1.3 trillion a year to help them fight the climate crisis. They were only offered $300 billion a year. They said they had to accept because the previous number had been $100 billion, and at least they were moving forwards, but most of them are hugely disappointed. Ambassador Thomas Granger, so how do we fix this, what appears to be a broken multilateral system, maybe because of the old thinking, the old way of thinking of those imperialist and colonial powers that don't want to adapt to the new reality?
There is obviously no quick fix. I think what we again need is a political commitment, and then of course this brings us back to the question of political leadership. States, leaders that are ready to invest in multilateral mechanisms, in multilateral institutions, that believe in living up to commitments by international law, by international humanitarian law, so that are credible figures in trying to restore an order with solid, efficient, effective multilateral institutions. I mean, if you look back, and I think the assessment has been made, you have had more and more leaders that invested, that believed in transactional approaches to problem solving instead of, investing in rules-based approaches, in creating sustainable long-term mechanisms and platforms. You had, major powers grossly violating international law, international humanitarian law, and I think in that sense, the 3 wars that we currently, the major wars that we witness, they're just a mirror of these trends in the global order. So again, these double standards in approaching IL and IHL violations, I think they need to be overcome. So again, I think we need a new generation of leaders that are ready to invest in multilateral institutions and that help us recreate a new global order that is, yes, multipolar, multicentric, multicultural. I think we are not questioning that. What we are questioning is, that currently this multipolar order looks very chaotic. we don't see really these positive order-shaping forces in this order. And so it's currently, as we see it, it's inherently unstable. And so I think, yeah, what we are looking forward to in a medium to perhaps long term is again positive order shaping forces. And I think here I would agree, you know, smaller middle powers can play an important role. And this perhaps, you know, to end on a positive note, when you look back how we dealt with the polarization, with the confrontation during the Cold War, there was a process that many have forgotten about, the Helsinki process, you know, that led to the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe and eventually to the OSCE. And in creating that process, in animating it, in facilitating between the superpowers, the so-called NNN, the neutrals and the non-aligned, they played a fundamental role. And in that sense, perhaps in the short to medium term, while, as I said at the outset, there is no quick fix in reforming multilateral bodies. But I think in the short to medium term, these smaller and middle states can assume an important role in getting us to a more stable multipolar world order.
Okay, I told the panelists that whatever I say, it's just an excuse for them to offer their expertise. So what I suggest is that you all open your mics and then jump in while the other's talking. Okay, let's have a bit of a discussion. Too much of me is asking you questions and you giving answers. You're the expert, so let's bounce off each other. But Kilic Burakanat, you haven't had a question yet, and this is important. We'll get your expertise on how these middle-order countries, like Turkey especially, fit into the multilateral system. But because you spend a lot of your time in Washington, D.C., how does Donald Trump fit into the discussion we're having, right? Obviously, everybody's going to ask that question about everything, including what McDonald's meals you order.
I'm supposed to have the easiest question, but get the hardest, and it's difficult to describe the situation right now. But let me start by answering a question that you asked at the beginning. Are we living the worst of the times? And I think, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but we may not. It could get worse. And here are the reasons. Number one, in regards to our panel's name is War and Order, in regards to the new emerging international order, we do not even agree what is emerging right now. We know that it is not unipolar world right now, but militarily it still seems so at certain point. Economically, we definitely live in a bipolar world right now, and diplomatically, increasingly we are in a multipolar world. So even about the conceptualization, scholars are competing with one another to coin the term. Multiplex international order, post-superpower international order, we do not even agree about the name yet. On the other hand, something that we shouldn't forget, there is new actors emerging. And these new actors, if we were studying this, discussing this 20 years ago, it would be non-state groups, terrorist organizations, etc. But right now, multinational corporations, tech giants, are playing a significant role, especially in the time that we are living with the introduction of quantum computing and artificial intelligence. We still don't know what will be the standards, what will be the rules, what will be the benchmarks, what kind of conventions do we need to, does the international community need to prepare in order to have a rule-based international order that will involve those tech companies. Secondly, in regards to war, we are still in a position that there is a transformation. Everybody agrees that there is a revolution in military affairs right now, but that transformation may here to stay for a longer period of time. Usually when these kind of revolutions happen, it happened in one war, and then we would change our literature. But we see increasing blurring of the wars and conflicts. In good old times, in conflict spectrum, we used to have insurgencies and armed groups, state-to-state war, and nuclear race. But right now, in one conflict, we could have all of them together. And at the same time, we are seeing that the use of technology in the war situations on the ground is becoming more complicated. Because of that, in the good old times, we used to call it complex situation. Now it become complicated. We are even have difficulty to understand this. And more significantly, nobody seems to be ready to prepare strategically for this emerging uncertainties and unpredictabilities. We are not sure. States, non-state actors have this constant tactical adaptation to emerging orders, new technologies, new threats. But it is so difficult to provide strategic foresight and strategic adaptability to this current situation. And I know that I'm out of time, but 2 minutes on Turkey. And I agree with all of the participants about the role that these middle powers can play from now on. Because yes, we have major powers, but we see that all of those major powers are in decline. After the elections in the United States, whatever happens, we have a divided country over there. And domestic issues will be more prevalent than international issues. And there is significantly lack of willingness on the part of Trump administration to lead the world or to establish a new rule-based international order. China is facing significant economic challenges. And European Union couldn't prove itself as being a significant actor to establish new rules, new norms that would lead us to a new international order. And under this condition, the secondary powers, middle powers, whatever you call, or regional powers, can play a significant role. And most significantly and most urgently, the role that they can play is being stabilizer in regional conflicts. I think we need that role more than anything else. Turkey has been trying to do that, and Turkey has been advocating the institutional reform, especially at the UN National Security Council, UN Security Council. And we know that, and this is somehow tragic. Gabriel Garcia Marquez has this novel, a story of a crime foretold. And in the story, there was a crime that would be committed by two potential murderers, and throughout novel, nobody stopped to prevent that. And we have been talking about the problem in UN Security Council for the last 30 years.
Yep.
At least, right? And publicly, we have been talking about this for the last 20 years. And more general public, especially after COVID and climate change, ordinary public started to talk about this. This is not an elite discussion or technical discussion anymore. This is an ordinary person is saying that there should be a reform in UN Security Council. And no steps has been taken. And Turkey has been in the front line in asking for the reform of the UN Security Council. And we know that Turkey would not be, it cannot change this alone, but with these secondary powers, with a collective action, pushing the permanent members and pushing other countries who are taking advantage of the current international order, we can make a difference. And the hope is, I start with pessimism, and optimistic note here is, everybody knows that we need to change this order at the UN. Everybody knows that we have global governance. Everybody knows that these global issues, pandemic, climate change, and other issues necessitate global cooperation. And that is the most significant achievement that international community created in the last 2 or 3 years.
Really, really very great points by all of you. And as soon as I said Donald Trump, Professor Georges was like, I need to say something.
Well, I mean, I think we seem to agree. I think the relative consensus that this is an inflection point, that the world is at a turning point, or rather a breaking point. And the question is really, what can be done? Historically speaking, if our analysis is correct, we should really expect a great powers war. In history, from the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 up to the Iran-Iraq war, all great ruptures lead to great wars. But let's the question is, how do we manage this particular moment in history? I have several points as an academic, and I look at it really from this part of the world, as really look at from the inside out as opposed from the outside in. The first thing I think, and I agree, that the middle powers, whether you're talking about Turkey or Brazil or Pakistan or India, I think they have a major role to play what I call a third way, the third way option between a relatively declining hegemon, the United States, and a rising power, China. I think this can be in terms of really interest, economic interest, geo-economic interest, not just in terms of romantic ideas. And this is a very important point. Let's pontificate and call it a global alliance for humanity. That at the heart of this alliance is really economic interest, mutual benefits, and what have you. Secondly, I think the question for me is not really the West versus the rest, as some of us like to. I don't think there is a West, a monolith. I think rather it's the rest versus the hegemons. And it's not just the United States when we talk about hegemons. I think when we talk about middle powers, or rather the third way, I think we should really align ourselves with many Western powers who really view the world in the same way we do. Spain, Ireland, Malta, Norway, and what have you. The third point I really would like to see is that instead of really somehow dismissing international institutions as part of the rules-based international liberal order, why not try to use these institutions, as South Africa has done wonderfully? The International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, the United Nations, and its agencies. This could be really, in a way, we could really own international institutions. We could really, as the International Criminal Court has really done in the past few days. And I think finally here, when I talk about the hegemon, I know that we tend to focus on the United States because the United States has been the dominant power for many years. But I think I also, I want to just add a footnote about the tendency in many parts of the world to look at China as a romantic, utopian thing. China is about China. China is about transactional. China is not, where's China in this particular conflict in Gaza? China does not really have a geopolitical, vision. China has a geo-economic vision, and it's all about China. So we should not really count on China, let alone Russia. And finally, I think I want to come back to one point about the Middle East, the greater Middle East. What I really would like to say, and I think it's doable. I'm not going to really talk about these kind of, a new security architecture, a new balance of power. I like to see really a minimalist kind of a bloc made up of Turkey, Iran, and the Arab state. And this particular bloc can really play a major role in stability, in security, in geo-economic benefits. And I think what we're seeing in the Gulf post 7th of October, a great deal of maturity, diversification of foreign policy, normalization from top down is out of the notion, a gradual deepening of normalization between Iran and Saudi Arabia. These are really hopeful points, beginning. The question is, how do you put it into operation? How do you really set up, create this particular bloc, regional bloc, in order to really deal with major conflict in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya, in Palestine, and of course in Lebanon, helping Lebanon stand up on its feet after 6 years of broken economy and what have you.
Yeah. Foreign Minister Carr, with you in just a moment. Thomas?
Yeah, just on the subject on what to do now. One aspect, let me perhaps start differently. I think one of the reasons for the mess that we are currently in is the demise and the unraveling of the global and regional arms control architecture, right? And here I would argue, let's watch out that we preserve at least what is still working, what is still functioning, while we wait, perhaps, for the major powers to resume their strategic stability dialogue again, while we wait for the P5 to again constructively talk to one another on nuclear arms and other issues relevant to strategic stability, like hypersonic outer space, etc. But when I say, let us preserve what is still working, I think of NPT. I think that it's under pressure, yes, but by and large, it's still working. It's the nuclear test ban treaty, still under pressure, but still working. I think it's very important that we preserve these regimes while, obviously, we need to reconstruct a regional and global arms control architecture over the next 5, 10, 15 years. But we all know the fundamental ingredient for doing so is trust, and trust is so terribly lacking, and trust is not going to come back unless we have dealt with at least 2 of these major ongoing wars. But while we wait for these conflicts to be solved, while we wait to at least some trust being rebuilt, let us preserve what is still out there and working by and large.
Yeah. Foreign Minister Kar?
Yeah, I think just a few quick points as the practitioner once again, right? Because I think I keep on hearing wherever we go all over the world that there's a breakdown of the international order, as if the multilateral order that was holding the peace has suddenly broken down and people are not doing their job. I look at it as not the breakdown of the international multilateral order. I look at it as the breakdown of the intention of the superpowers, of powerful countries to follow multilateral order, which is without exceptionalism, which is universal in its values and also in the application of those values. And that is what you're seeing as a breakdown. Some pointed out the 49 times where veto power has been used. When Russia uses veto power to protect itself in Ukraine, it is considered to be a rogue state, an autocracy, etc. When the United States of America uses it to protect Israel, it is considered to still be legitimate because it is supposed to have the exceptionalism and of being the protector of human rights for all of the world. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really important to absorb that. The world order is not breaking. The governance of the world order, the use of veto powers has been weaponized and is being used to protect the propagators and the perpetuators of violence rather than to protect the victims of violence. I think that's one really important point I wanted to make. The other thing is we keep on talking about, what do we call this age? I call this age the age of impunity, which my colleague, my yesteryear's colleague, David Miliband, has even written, in his new role. It is the age of impunity because when the preservers of order start breaking the order, as again, the Iraq war, I think, started that trend, then everybody else follows. And I found it very interesting when it was, spoken about as to the Iran-Saudi Arabia peace versus the Pakistan-India almost being encouraged to be more unpeaceful. And what is the difference? One of the big players in the Pakistan-India in our region is being given that impunity that comes with being with a certain set of countries. Mm-hmm. And is being almost encouraged to be rogue within the region. However, in the Middle East, all countries are feeling rather unprotected by the, by the powerful countries, which were stabilizers generally, and seeing them as destabilizers, whether it's Trump, who was seen to be an aberration, 8 years back is now the norm, because at that time we all explained ourselves, oh, this is an aberration. It's not an aberration. People are reacting to what they see there, etc. Okay, not going to go too much in that detail. I think the question is, are we, 20 years back there was this thing about, are we in clash of civilizations, as Huntington said, or are we in the end of history phase, as Fukuyama said? Yeah. Clearly, we were in the clash of civilizations, and what has led to that? What has led to that, and countries like mine have been observing it from the sidelines, I've been pointing out, but we were called the others, right? Is the weaponization of orderly things such as human rights, such as democracy, such as liberal values. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. You go to war to protect human rights, only selectively. You go to war to protect political rights and democracy, and you don't deal with certain democracies only selectively. There are certain autocratic countries we have no problem dealing with, right? But there are certain other countries where we will go to war and kill millions or hundreds of thousands and displace millions, and it's fine because we are following order and values and human rights. And when people come up and say, oh, China is not going to protect human rights all over the world, to some of us, that's a sigh of relief. Because how the protection of human rights has been played out in regions like ours is not very congratulatory. So for some of us, like, thank God No one is going to impose their version of human rights on everybody all at the same time. Every country has to have its own journey. So when countries come out and say that, look, you do your thing, we do our thing, but it's just being realistic. So I don't think most of us are being pessimistic. I think we're just being realistic and seeing things as they are, because now we can't hide behind the shrouds of propagating values, whereas at the same time killing values. And my last point was, the final one, the reform of United Nations Security Council or the United Nations itself, right? I think a lot of us believe that if a reform leads to more centers of power being created, that's not reform, that is the opposite of reform. Reform and nothing in the last 5 years or maybe a decade, what we've seen is an in-your-face exhibition of that in the difference in the United Nations General Assembly vote versus the United Nations Security Council vote. So if you really do believe in democracy and people knowing you should look at the United Nations General Assembly vote on Gaza and Israel issue, and then look at the vetoes that have been used. So a reform has to be egalitarian. It cannot be a reform which recognizes, these middle powers are emerging, let's give them also more power to use, to protect theirs, etc. So I think eventually, let me just end by saying that if we do not believe in the universality of all values, whether it is people-centric, such as human rights, or country-centric, such as nations' right to go into unregulated warfare in the name of self-defense. We have seen self-defense stretch to the limit of having the impunity to attack anyone. And I can just really scare the world by saying one thing. A country like ours, which went nuclear, has never felt so good about having taken this decision than it does today, because when we see expansion of the war theater into areas at will, without any cover of international law or anything else, you are thankful for some deterrence. And I put that as a warning sign because this is clearly a signal that is going all over the world.
Okay, I just want to get instruction from the people who are directing us on stage. I was hoping we may have an extra 5 minutes because we started a bit late. What the audience can't see is there's only 3.5 minutes of the session left. So let's see if we get 5 extra minutes. I want to come to you, Professor Salame, in just a moment, but you had something to say, Bora?
I just want to add something, and we were talking about how middle powers can play a significant constructive role for the future. And it's important to remember that we shouldn't underestimate the importance of the values, human rights and others. Because what hurts current international order, I don't want to use West, but Western hegemony in certain discourse about the values was the Gaza crisis. Nothing was more destructive to the current international order at the public level than the Gaza crisis. And human rights violations in other countries, whether it is China, whether it is other countries in Asia, Africa, or in Europe, or the discrimination against the Muslims or Islamophobia. What lowered the trust to these institutions was what's happening over there. And trust for building an international order is the heart of the thing. And I cannot agree with you more about this. And it is the heart of the international system. It is what brings countries together, what brings peoples together, and what makes people to believe those institutions. And if it is the heart, you cannot talk about an overwhelmingly healthy person with a heart disease. So if you cannot establish that trust and build that trust for those institutions, you cannot form an international order and make international community to follow that.
I think that's a really, really important point. And that trust is about a personal issue that has to be reflected in the people who govern us. We all come from different countries, but we all have the same moral standards, the people in this room. And what we need is for our governments to reflect our moral values. But when we come back to the critical issue here, Prof, it's about what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. Right? You've all seen the pictures. Working in the studio, the way me and some of our fellow presenters at TRT World do, It's absolutely crazy, the things that we see. We don't show you a lot of the worst pictures of the hand of the boy, of the 8-year-old who was playing marbles and he was bombed and the marble is still in his dead hand. If there's no accountability for what's happening in Gaza, Prof, what are we left with?
I fear that Gaza has set a standard that will be used elsewhere because of impunity. If after all what you describe, there is impunity, then it will be emulated elsewhere. Because countries will say, if Israel can do it, I should be able to do it. And there are enough conflicts in the world where this kind of things could happen. I see conflicts in Africa, I see conflicts in Asia, and to be closer to Gaza, the way Israel conducted its war in Lebanon, where 4,000 civilians have been killed in the past 2 months, is not to be forgotten. Now let me pick on 2 issues that have been discussed on the panel. The first one, which is, and President Erdogan mentioned it yesterday in his speech as well, the reform of the Security Council. Having served in the UN system for many years, I can say there are basically 2 different ways of looking at it. A dominant and useless one, and another more creative one. The dominant method of looking at the reform is to add the number of the countries who have a veto power, saying that now you need to bring in Japan and India and Brazil, you name it, and Germany, etc. I think that the use of the veto power has been negative enough, so I don't want more countries to have that right. I would like fewer countries to use the veto power. And by the way, if Brazil is selected, Mexico is not happy. If Germany is selected, Italy is not happy. If India is selected, Pakistan is not happy. And China will not be happy to see Japan with a veto power. And who will represent Africa, by the way?
Yeah.
You have the Nigerians, the South Africans, you name it. So I think this way of looking at the reform of the Security Council is useless. A more creative one is what we call the Liechtenstein Amendment. That is when a very small country in Europe came with an idea that every country that uses the veto power in the Security Council must come before the General Assembly and explain why it used the veto.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it ends at that, but it's already a step. I think the second step would be a vote in the General Assembly to congratulate or to chastise the country that has used the veto. And in fact, the other way of looking at the reform of the Security Council is not to multiply the number of those who have the veto power, but on the contrary, to limit the use of that right by those who are already having it. The second point I would like to raise is the nuclear issue, because it has been also mentioned in this panel. It's worrying. It's worrying that China has decided to double its warheads from 1,500 to 3,000 warheads by the year 2030. It's worrying that Russia has changed its nuclear doctrine, making the use of nuclear weapons more easily. It's worrying that the 3 Western countries, France, UK, and the US, are now spending a lot of money to renew their nuclear arsenal. It's also worrying that a minister in the Israeli government at the beginning of the Gaza war goes out and says, why don't we drop a nuclear bomb over the Gaza Strip? The banalization of the nuclear issue is something that is extremely worrying. And therefore, there is a review every 5 years of the NPT, of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And there is in this treaty a very important article that says that those nuclear power should be exemplary in their behavior, should limit their arsenal, and should not threaten to use their nuclear powers, in particular against non-nuclear countries. So if we have an opportunity in 2025 for a new review of the NPT, and I think it is the opportunity to concentrate the efforts of the non-nuclear powers on the duty of those who are already nuclear to behave in a completely different manner.
The banalization of the nuclear threat, I like it a lot. My kids are just coming out of their teens, and they asked me recently, are we going to have a nuclear war? Thomas, you want to say something, and then we will end, and then it'll be time for a break. But Thomas, please.
Yeah, just coming back to these double standards, and I think it's extremely important to say it very clearly that, you know, the reluctance of the political...
Microphone, Thomas, please.
The reluctance of the political West to condemn the severe IHL violations of Israel in Gaza has massively undermined the credibility, the reputation of the political West, and including the credibility of this rules-based order that the political West stands for. And I think here there needs clearly to be much more self-criticism on behalf of the political West if it, you know, wants to kind of continue to be a credible advocate and promoter of this rules-based order. At the same time, I think self-criticism would also apply to other actors. Let us be honest, you know, there is a lot of applying of double standards everywhere. You also see it the other way around, for instance, when addressing or not addressing, you know, severe breaches of international law, for instance, by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. You know, there was a huge disappointment in the political West that this, by many important representatives of the global South, by dynamic institutions like the BRIC, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that this was not addressed at all. I mean, we can easily see why, but I think we should all be more self-critical in terms of applying double standards if we want to stabilize the global order, and if you want to bring back credibility to multilateral institutions, to IL, international law, and international humanitarian law.
Let's see what happens on January the 21st and the 4 years that will follow after that. Thanks very much indeed to the panel, and we'll have a short break. Thank you.